When Steve opened this series, he pointed out that Mark's Gospel, the first and the shortest of the four, was written by a man in a hurry. A man who wanted to convey with a broad sweep the 3-year ministry of Jesus. Not for Mark, the lead-in at his birth, his early life. Jesus as the Word. He opens his Gospel with John the Baptist as the fulfillment of the prophecies found in Malachi and Isaiah. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way, a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight paths for him. Clear the way, Jesus is coming. Let him through. Mark's Gospel is, in essence, an extended CV. See what this man did and accomplished in 3 short years. He was a healer, a charismatic teacher, a thorn in the flesh of the religious authorities, a reinterpreter of the rules, a wonderful storyteller, a miracle worker, and the Son of God, who allowed himself to be crucified for the sins of the world, that we might gain a new relationship with Father God through his sacrifice that we have been singing about this morning. He seldom seemed to have a day off. Chapter 10 begins with Jesus the teacher continuing to teach the crowd that had been following him. And in this regard, as one commentator said, Jesus knew perfectly well that a great proportion of his hearers were hardened and unbelieving. Much of his labour was in vain, and yet he continued. Is this an example for everyone in ministry today? Matthew 25 says, not the good and successful servant, but the good and faithful servant will enter into the joy of the Lord. And then we see Jesus, the reinterpreter of the rules, facing up once again to the Pharisees. And so we come to today's question. Yes? Brilliant, because I had God's reminding people of things. So, we come to today's question and answer session. Chapter 10, verses 1 to 9. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Before I go any further, I don't want those of you here or online who are single thinking that you can switch off at this point. The passage will have a relevance for you, for although the question Jesus is asking is concerning divorce and marriage, I hope that by the end you will see that his message to his hearers can be applied to many questions relating to the ways in which we live our lives and how God looks upon us. I must admit that my initial reaction when I read this was, oh my goodness, what have I let myself in for? Another controversial topic. And haven't we had enough of those of late? However, divorce being a subject that can be as much of a hot potato today as it was in Jesus' time. As I began to unpick it, I realised that it was a far more positive topic than might at first appear. And once again, I'm talking about an interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees. Really, I don't do it on purpose. However, as they crop up in all the Gospels challenging Jesus on his interpretation of the law, I will admit that I do enjoy studying Jesus' responses and how the questions allow us to explore the connections between the Old Testament and the New. We know from the onset that the Pharisees' purpose is looking for evidence to silence Jesus. They questioned with whose authority he healed, cast out demons, while at the same time, as we read in Matthew 12, asking him for miraculous signs. They questioned his healing on the Sabbath, his lack of washing before eating, even who he ate with. And as the question to be asked next time is, should they be paying taxes to Caesar? And so, to Mark 10. The Pharisees must have thought that they had come up with a really good question. Jesus would have to come down on one side or another. Divorce in Jesus' day was, as I've said, as contentious a topic as it is in many churches today. In Matthew, their question is more specific. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? At that time, there were two differing rabbinic schools of thought on the matter. One rabbi stated it was for adultery only, and Rabbi Hillel allowed the most trivial of reasons to justify a man divorcing his wife. We would be forgiven for imagining some of them to be completely fictitious if there weren't rabbinical evidence to back them up. I could have been guilty for burning the peas, because he said if a wife cooks her husband food ill by over-salting it or over-roasting it, she is to be put away. Can any of us say we haven't had a disaster in the kitchen? But this wasn't all. If I'd spoken so loudly that those next door could hear me, or be seen speaking to strangers in the street, something I do all the time, in fact, anything the man found disagreeable would have been grounds for divorce. All one way, only the woman, nothing to do with the man. He, as usual, is perfect. So, how is Jesus going to answer? Whichever way he came down on this, the Pharisees thought that they would have him banged to rights. But Jesus replied, "What did Moses command you?" He put the onus onto the questioner. A very good tactic? Yes. They had to explain their understanding of the Old Testament. Jesus didn't ask them what God commanded. He asked them what Moses commanded. In fact, nobody commanded anything. They only permitted it. Their reply was short and to the point. Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her on her way. And indeed, in Deuteronomy 24, it does say, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. In Mark chapter 10, verse 5, Jesus points out that Moses wrote this law only because of the hardness of their hearts. In citing Moses, Jesus was laying himself open to condemnation if his response was seen in any way to be critical of Moses, who was deemed by the Jews to be God's mouthpiece and therefore untouchable. Jesus, in his answer to the Pharisees, avoids the charge of blasphemy, much to their great disappointment, I'm sure, by bringing God into the discussion. It's as if Jesus says, you want to talk about divorce, I want to talk about marriage, as God originally intended it to be. Indeed, how it should be. I'll show you how far the people have moved away from God's ideal that in order to keep society together, God had permitted a reworking of the marriage laws. This was how important marriage was to a stable society, then and now. Let's go back to the beginning, said Jesus, to Genesis. At the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. And as with everything that God created, in the beginning, it was good. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife. And the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. I wonder at this point whether the Pharisees even had a clear understanding of what biblical marriage was all about. Marriage, and by implication family, in the Old Testament was a sign of God's blessing. Marriage, as God had planned it, was not a trivial union between man and woman, but something solemn, meaningful, and mutually beneficial. A new unit, a new family, leaving parents behind to strike out on their own, something that would last, that would benefit society as a whole. God had created a perfect world. Humans, almost from the beginning, messed it up and continue to mess it up. But God, in his mercy, still loves those he created in his image and makes allowances. He gave the people the 10 Commandments, which had been all to keep them, which, had we all been able to keep them, could have created a great society based on strong, close relationships with God, family, and community. And this would have included marriage, happy and lasting. However, these laws have not been kept. God tolerated behaviours in Israel, and still does today, that are not up to the standards he originally envisaged. He tolerated and tolerates, permitted things that were less than perfect because he recognised that we had hardened our hearts. But by pointing out that God had permitted behaviours that seemed to dilute his laws, Jesus wasn't saying that God's laws were to be ignored. He reminds us in Matthew that he hadn't come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. Those laws had not been put in place to grind us down or make us afraid or feel a failure. Jesus' answer to another Pharisee's question as to the greatest commandment said, "Love the Lord your God with all your hearts, with all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. All the laws and the prophets hang on these two commands." I said at the outset that Jesus was a reinterpreter of the rules. And as we have read in the New Testament, we see how he does this. You have heard it was said, but I tell you. And so it is with Jesus' definition of family. He extends the idea to encompass the church family, which includes the unmarried, was to be instrumental in producing a strong, stable society reflecting God's love and blessing in the world. As we read through the New Testament, we see Jesus time and time again treating those who have strayed with understanding, compassion, spelling out that love that casts out fear. And so, at the end of the question and answer session, what would the crowd have learnt, and what will they take away? I suspect that once more the Pharisees were frustrated, furious even. Once again, Jesus had failed to fall into their carefully laid trap. How many wasted man-hours had they taken to try and come up with the perfect question? I would be surprised if they even paid much attention to his reasoning. I ask forgiveness if this was not the case. The crowd and the disciples, what of them? I would hope that some thought about that perfect plan God had at the creation and how they had contributed to its failure. I would hope that they realised how they had been led astray by rabbinical teaching. But most of all, I hope that they had begun to realise that Jesus was opening a new way of looking at things. He was bringing them life in all its fullness, grounded in love. And this is what he brings to each and every one of us every day. Amen.